What does suicide say about society? What does society say about suicide? What did those who take their lives say about society and the environmental factors at play? On 18th, 19th May, we held a symposium on suicide, society, and crisis. Funded by a Wellcome Trust Seed Award and with the support of Medical Humanities Sheffield and the Humanities Research Institute at the University of Sheffield, we were able to bring together a wide array of academics, practitioners, charity workers, and mental health activists to consider the correlation between macro crisis and personal crisis. No longer a taboo subject in many societies, including our own, suicide is the ultimate expression of personal crisis. According to the World Health Organization, a person commits suicide somewhere in the world every 40 seconds. In 2017, the country with the highest suicide rate was Sri Lanka and the lowest Barbados. While most countries with high suicide rates are poor, there are also highly developed and rich nations which rank very high on the suicide rate rankings. Generally, committing suicide is about 3 times more common in men than in women. It is more and more seen as symptomatic of a crisis in and of masculinity. Since the late 19th century, the sociological approach to suicide has rested on the premise that the degree of integration in any given social unit is inverse to the number of suicides in that unit. Emile Durkheim's taxonomy of suicide is the most well-known and its influence the most enduring. So he differentiated between egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, and anomic suicide. The common denominator is that suicide is explained by the individual's relation to society or as an individual's response to social, political, and moral crisis. Suicides and the rhetoric of suicide is situated between private and collective crisis, individual mental health and the condition of the body politic, and the psychological subject and society. However, this social or socially determined interpretation of suicide has hardly been a constant. The pendulum swings between an individuated, patient-based mental health model where suicide is the act of a unique individual and each act is a suicide event. And in general, in this approach, external crisis is incidental and suicide is largely divested of political meaning, versus those approaches that give due weight to external factors as causality. So the central question we considered was this: how does national crisis interact with personal crisis? How is suicide evidence of the internalization of crisis? We came together for the symposium to learn from each other, to share research findings, to develop new research questions, and to plug into vital public and policy debates about the link between mental health and macro crisis. There is, of course, a strong correlation between personal desperation, suicide, and national crisis. Across time and space, this correlation or causation is something that has been diagnosed and constructed by clinicians and coroners, academics and artists, politicians and pundits, the media, and by suicides themselves. The ever-growing concern about suicidality and suicide at times of real and media-magnified political crisis must resonate with all of us. This pressing problem echoes across borders, across time periods, and across disciplines. And just for some of the most recent examples, it's undeniable that the financial crisis, the migrant crisis, terrorism, and Brexit have each alone and cumulatively taken their toll on the mental health of communities and of individuals. Each of these emergencies, these examples of social disintegration, these aberrations from phases of relative stability, are linked to scarily mounting rates of suicide. One of the things that many of us wondered about coming into the conference was the meaning of crisis, how it would be defined, who defines it, and whether its overuse makes it ultimately an unhelpful term. At the start of our discussion, there was much discussion about the ambiguity of the term crisis. Indeed, crisis may well have the opposite meaning, I think, than that with which it is usually ascribed. What I mean by this is that crisis is the norm, actually, and social stability and political sanity possibly the aberration. That being said, it was interesting that by the end of our intensive 2 days together, many of us left wondering about the meaning, the definition, and the categorization of suicide.
My name's Chris Millard. I'm a historian of medicine and a historian of psychiatry, and I'm interested in the histories of psychological categories. And it's really fantastic as a historian to be at this conference because there are people from many different disciplines who are all talking about suicide from their own perspectives, from their own disciplinary backgrounds. And when you get people in a room together talking about suicide in these different ways, it can really help to fire off interesting research avenues. My particular contribution to this conference is based around a number, and it's the number of people who were thought in Britain in the middle of the 20th century to be attempting suicide. Suicide becomes really important in the middle of the 20th century because there are debates in the 1950s about decriminalising suicide. Suicide and attempted suicide are both crimes in this country up to 1961. Now, in the course of the debates in Parliament and in the Home Office about whether to decriminalise and how to decriminalise suicide, this number is used over and over again. It's between 25 and 40,000 people who are thought to attempt suicide every year. So people who try to commit suicide but do not succeed, and what to do about the mental and physical health care of these people. And so in the debates about decriminalisation, what happens in Parliament is that people get very passionate about the fact that there are tens of thousands of people who need psychological help after a suicide attempt and are potentially denied it because the police might get involved because a crime has been committed. And so this number of tens of thousands of people, it's very powerful. It has persuasive force in these debates. But it's not accurate. In fact, it's incredibly inaccurate. And my paper is trying to say that we should not miss the numerical inaccuracy of this number, and instead we should appreciate how symbolic and powerful it is. This number is taken from the number of suicides and attempted suicides in the Metropolitan Police District of London. These are then multiplied up by 7, according to a ratio that's taken from North America in cities in Boston and Los Angeles. And then this is then transposed upon the Registrar General's statistics for suicide in England and Wales. So numbers coming from all over the place, mashed together, multiplied up, and you get a nice, round, memorable number. So this number is inaccurate, but it is still incredibly powerful. We should not mistake its inaccuracy for its irrelevance. And what instead we should do is appreciate how, regardless of how accurate it is, it can still be an incredibly persuasive and important part of the debates around the decriminalisation of suicide in the 1950s and 1960s.
So since the financial recession in 2008 and the UK government's resultant austerity measures, we've seen a small but increasing number of newspaper reports linking austerity and particularly welfare reform to suicides. Disabled people's activism, groups such as Disabled People Against Cuts, DPAC, have been central in getting public attention on suicides linked to welfare reform, such as Callum's List and the Black Triangle campaign, and some even maintain public websites listing newspaper coverage of austerity suicides. In this newspaper coverage, family members and coroners' reports are used to show that welfare cuts and policy can kill people. Yet the Department for Work and Pensions, the DWP, responsible in the UK for instigating welfare reform, keep no systematic record of the circumstances surrounding these suicides and are often quick to deny any causal link between welfare reform and suicide. Department for Work and Pensions spokespeople cited in newspaper coverage usually point out that suicide is complex and rarely linked to a single cause. Their approach is in line with World Health Organization guidance on how suicide should be reported in the media, which clearly states that suicides shouldn't be framed as understandable within particular contexts. But here we see how the complexity of suicide can be used to deny government culpability. Yet accounts from family, suicide notes and coroner's reports point to the austere landscape against which many suicides take place. Families talk about long battles with the system, immense anxiety waiting to hear if you've been found fit to work, degrading and humiliating work capability assessments, and sleepless nights of worry. These accounts show that many suicides linked to welfare reform are not a sudden impulsive reaction to a single letter from the Department for Work and Pensions, but the systematic wearing down of people. This for me can be understood using Rob Nixon's work as the slow violence of austerity and welfare reform, the violence of delayed effects that kills people slowly. This points to the need for a psychopolitical analysis of these deaths, one that takes seriously the psychological impact of austerity measures, anxiety, worry, and the widespread stigmatisation of welfare claimants as skivers and scroungers in the UK media. This is different from saying that suicide is always linked to mental health problems, and instead thinks more deeply about how our psychic lives, so our feelings, anxieties, our attachments, are shaped by policies. This stigmatisation gets inside people. Family accounts show how people's fear of being a burden was often a key reason for their suicide. It's not a coincidence that people feel like a burden. The framing of welfare claimants and disabled people more generally as a burden has been central in government and media narratives, used to justify punitive welfare reform now for years. Instead of the secret reviews of death of a customer carried out by the Department for Work and Pensions, we need public analysis of austerity suicides that is attuned to context and able to illuminate culpability of government reforms, while still retaining an understanding of the complexity of suicide. A key move would be for both the DWP and the media to move away from analysing suicides only as individual cases and in always assuming that suicide is a result of mental illness. We can learn a lot here from the activism of disabled people's groups in how to recognise the complexity of suicide, yet also recognise the culpability of government policy in killing people.
At the Symposium on Suicide, Society and Crisis, I presented my research on an apparent suicide epidemic coinciding with the Munich crisis and its fallout in 1938-1939. I was using this case study to consider the correlation between collective and personal crisis. My interest in the history of suicide was ignited when I was doing research on British women's engagement and investment in foreign policy and the international crisis of 1938. When I was looking into how the general population responded to and was affected by the Munich crisis, I came across dozens of newspaper reports of suicides that were apparently triggered by the international crisis and fear of war. The dramatic unfolding of the September crisis, as it was called, that culminated in the signing of the Four Power Agreement in Munich on the 30th of September 1938, received blanket coverage at the time, and it really consumed the attention and the nervous energy of people across the social spectrum, across the country, and indeed across the world. In myriad ways and forms, the international crisis was personalized and internalized by rich and poor, by women and men, by urbanites and country folk, by the young and the old, by the healthy and the ill, and equally by those who were actors in the drama, as well as those who were relatively powerless. As war veteran, Bloomsburyite, classic scholar, and crisis diarist Peter Lucas put it, he said, "The crisis seems to have filled the world with nervous breakdowns, or perhaps the crisis itself is one of only many more nervous breakdowns of a world driven by the killing pace of modern life and competition into ever acuter neurasthenia." How did it feel to live through it all? How did it feel to want to die because of the oppressive war fear and due to spiraling levels of personal and public anxiety? What is clear is that private and individual experience mirrored the collective and the public. On the subjective level, this was a period of acute anxiety, suspense, and the exacerbation of nervous disorders and mental illness. One of the very saddest patterns to detect is a rise in the rate, or at least in the press coverage, of suicides. In Britain, in one after another report of coroner's proceedings, the war scare was identified as the cause of suicide. A foreign correspondent, aged 35, from Glasgow, Miss Edith Oakley, responded to Mass Observation's question, "What would you do in the event of war?" this way. She said, "There is a common belief that the next war will involve attacks upon the civil population, air raids, gas, bombardments, etc. That would terrify me, and I should seek escape to the desolate regions of the Scottish Highlands, commit suicide, or go mad." Indeed, a spate of war fear-triggered suicides was tangible evidence of the dramatic domestic impact of this international crisis. From the sources I've consulted so far, these suicides were treated with understanding and sympathy, even though it would not be until 1961 with the Suicide Act that suicide was decriminalized in the UK. The unifying characteristic of these suicide cases was fear of what was to come and refusal to live through another war. For example, fear that there might soon be another European war was the reason given at a Hammersmith inquest for the suicide of John James MacDonald, a 42-year-old fitters engineer. He gassed himself at his home. He had served in the Navy during the Great War. A girl who had lived in Germany and was worried by the crisis fell to her death from a hotel window soon after returning from a dance. An open verdict was returned on Alice May Gibbons, 26, of South Harting. A woman novelist, Mrs. Marie Winch, aged 43, was found shot in her home in Maidstone. Her husband, Lieutenant Winch, said that the September crisis had upset her, and she was also obsessed by a fear that her small daughter was going to be taken away from her. A railwayman's suicide was blamed on the European crisis. I could give many more examples, but there are a couple of things that stand out and that suggest that there was a distinct category of war fear suicides. What does stand out as unique to this spate of suicides is one of the recurrent suicide methods, and that is suicide by gas poisoning and even by gas mask. There is a preponderance of cases in which gas, fear of gas, war, or the specter of the gas mask figure prominently. Even more poignant were cases where the government-issued gas mask was repurposed as a means of self-murder. So I'm looking at these cases to illuminate these questions. What does society say about suicide? What does suicide say about the state of society? And what do suicides themselves say about the world they are living in and why they want to leave that world?
This conference is important because it brings to light a very important issue that often gets sort of scuttled to the side, that is suicide, which is something that is difficult for people to talk about and deal with. And this conference allows us to put it into various academic disciplines and ongoing discussions between scholars so we can actually begin to understand more about the phenomena generally and what we've encountered in our own work. I've already gained a great deal by attending the conference. Even simply seeing the call for papers and how it was organized, it helped me to think about a topic that I had found which involved a suicide and how to begin talking about it in a way that would be able to reveal its historical significance. I'm actually talking about the suicide of an individual named Stefan Lux, who is virtually forgotten, who shot himself in a session of the League of Nations in Geneva in July of 1936. And it was largely perceived as being a protest against the treatment of Jews in Germany, which it was. But one of the things I want to bring to light is that it also had to do with his feelings about the threat of Nazism generally, which was unusually perceptive about its threat to the world, and also how Nazism was using media in a way that people really weren't recognizing as being as duplicitous as it was. And then one of the other points I wanted to make for this, I think more appropriate for this conference, is that part of the reason why there wasn't very much attention paid to him is that the world had already gotten used to a wave of suicides of German Jews. So this wouldn't have been something that would necessarily have been that noticed in that way in particular.
So I think over the past decade or so, there's been a profound shift in our understanding of suicide, to the extent that people are increasingly looking at it as being a phenomenon which is shaped by wider society, by economics, by what's happening outside of the individual. And this conference is very timely, I think, because it's precisely bringing together the notion of suicide, society and crisis, the idea that suicide is something that transcends the individual, that we can't understand it by limiting it to the individual medical perspective. And this conference is important precisely because it's taking those issues and looking at them in a very broad way across different disciplines, across different historical periods. We've heard about suicide at the beginning of the Second World War in Germany. There are other papers looking at different national contexts and different historical periods. And we have specialists who have come from the discipline of sociology, from history, from psychology. We have practitioners. So I think it's a really rich and interesting conference in the way that it's opening up the subject of suicide, which traditionally has very much been caged within the narrow medical discipline, to such a wide range of disciplinary perspectives, historical periods and national contexts. So I think what I have gained is the opportunity to meet other academics who are fascinated by suicide, but are working in disciplines that are very far removed from my own. So to hear from historians who are talking about suicide crises during their particular, the historical periods that they specialise in, to hear from medical practitioners who are working with people who have suicidal tendencies. So really the opportunity to meet people who are fascinated by suicide but are working in historical periods or disciplines that are very different from my own. One of the issues that has been mentioned in some of the papers is that there is a taboo surrounding suicide, and it is a subject which is very much an object of censorship. There are certain rules regarding how you can talk about suicide and what you can say about it, and I think that censorship and that taboo surrounding suicide can sometimes shut down the conversation and prevent a fruitful discussion of a very complex issue. And I think this conference, what I've gained from it, is the opportunity to break open those taboos and push away that censorship and take suicide very seriously as a subject which deserves attention from a range of perspectives and from a range of disciplinary backgrounds. So my background is in French studies, and I think I have the extraordinary honour of being the only person at this conference who comes from French studies. And my area of expertise is workplace suicide in contemporary France. In France during the 2000s, the media and public health specialists began to talk about a suicide epidemic in the workplace. And what I'm interested in is why this is happening. Emile Durkheim at the end of the 19th century said that suicide was a mirror on society, that suicide transcends the individual and can tell us about the nature of the social order itself. So what I'm trying to do is take workplace suicide and examine what it tells us about the contemporary economic order and what it can tell us about the way economics relates to the human being. So my particular focus, my project is funded by the AHRC, and I am examining a corpus of suicide letters that were written by individuals employed by 3 large French corporations who took their own lives during the period between 2005 and 2015. And I'm interested in looking at what these letters tell us about why work or experience of work or working conditions would push somebody to take such extreme measures and would push somebody into a situation where they wish to take their own life rather than continue. Of course, workplace suicides aren't a uniquely French phenomenon. The statistics tell us that suicides linked to work or caused by work are on the rise across the international stage. So I really think this is a rising and urgent social phenomenon that deserves attention. And as I said, my particular approach is to look at it from the perspective of the lived and narrated experiences of those who make the desperate decision to take their own lives.
The link between the individual and intensely personal act of suicide and the broader social repercussions, social context in which that act takes place is very complex but also highly fascinating for scholarship. And I think this conference is very important in bringing together a variety of scholars, historians of different periods, but also scholars from other backgrounds, from other disciplines, and even mental health activists. By attending this conference, I gained a broader view of different case studies and contexts, early modern, Victorian England, interwar England, and I was especially impressed by one presentation by a mental health activist who quite openly talked about her own suicidality. And it's not a kind of talk I often have the opportunity to listen to, and it made a strong impression on me, though I'm not quite sure what to make of it at this point, but I continue reflecting. What I presented to this conference is actually a fairly old paper, which I kind of rehash, but which now intrigues me in new ways. And this paper is on suicide and crisis in Weimar Berlin. In Weimar Berlin, suicide was a highly charged issue. Newspapers, in contrast to today, reported very openly about individual cases, and they often try to ascribe a political meaning to them. Though Nazis, communists accused the system by pointing to suicides, but also liberal reformers made a case for a more humane school system, for instance, by stressing the suicides as the old rigid authoritarianism caused among young people. But one can also see how this link between suicide and crisis was adopted by contemporaries who try to kill themselves or to try to report about suicides, try to make sense of them. So one can see that many contemporaries assumed a very direct link between the times and the crisis at the end of the Weimar Republic and the individual act of suicide, that they had high expectations, they tried to put pressure on the authorities to provide assistance, but also often put high pressure on themselves. And that they contested the boundaries of what it meant to be a legitimate subject that even in a comparatively tolerant metropolis, as is Weimar Berlin, you see how people struggled with these boundaries, how they contested them and often clashed with them.